how do you think about human nature? Do you think we are inherently good or bad? I mean, we can even go back to the work you're doing and evening the playing field, racism, the way people are treated, poverty, all these things that arguably are like man-made. Why do they exist? Are we bad people? Or is it that gravitational pull we just aren't balancing effectively? How do you make sense of that?
I think like I think people are all like at their core trying their best, and they're trying to like optim. And I think the problem isn't around good or bad. It's more about like people not having the context or the information to like globally maximize. They're like locally optimizing based on the data they have and the peer set they have. And so there's like a local maxima problem. And so when you see situations of racism or intolerance and things like that, it's mostly because people are like, they don't have the exposure or the education, or the peer set around them is telling them something and then they feel it and believe it because they think that's right because others around them think that's right. And I think people are all like good, good inside and trying their best, but potentially like are misguided or have local maxima versus global maxima issues.
Mm.
And we're not immune to that. Like, yeah, maybe we have more perspectives than others, but we lack like millions of perspectives of other folks, or we haven't experienced the world in many ways, or if you haven't experienced something, you just like don't know what that feels like. So yeah, I think people are doing their best. I think um, oftentimes the like echo chamber pieces can create like some weird parts of society, but I don't even if people do bad things, I think it's hard to say someone is a bad person, or
Yeah.
even if they do good things, they're a good person.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, because just that story you told in the beginning, like there's luck involved in that you got that perspective, that you were
Yeah.
shown, like hypothetical, making it up, but like maybe your family stays in Canada and that situation never happens, and you never have.
Sure.
Then you could be one of those people who doesn't have the context, doesn't have enough of that, macro information. And that's an interesting thing to think about too. I mean, to me, that's one of the strongest drivers for empathy, I think, is that understanding like that type of concept, that easily could have been me. And you just put it in a way that I've never really thought about it before, but like the things we don't know, right? Let's even be arrogant here and say you and I know more than the average person, whatever that means. If you think about it proportionately, like we're probably like, let's say there's a billion things that to know. Like, yeah, maybe we know 10 and they know five. Like, so it feels like, oh, we know five more things. But in the scale of that billion, we both pretty much know nothing. So
Yeah.
that also drives like that empathy and that humility to be like, that's kind of goes back to that distrust point before for me. I'm always worried, like, I could be that asshole. I could be the one that causes that suffering, and I would never know it. There's a really good chance of that because and it probably already is happening right now.
Yep.
That's the thing that constantly drives me to be like, hey, question, check myself, ask these questions, do this show for that reason right there. Like that's kind of the root of it.
Yeah, and I think for any time you think, I bet there's loads of cases where someone thinks they're doing the right thing, but someone else like thinks they're doing
Mm.
wrong or being an asshole, or whatever. And I'm sure we've all been that person in our lives too, maybe not even known it. And I think as if we live as we go through life, become more aware of those things and like open up our minds, be open to new perspectives, like in everything, right? Whether it's like career or friendship or knowledge or whatever it is. I think I will try to do that. I'll try and do that as much as I can. And it's one of the reasons I love technology in general. It's just I feel like it's a constant way to like learn new things and experience like new tools and new things that may have a massive impact on society. And so it's one of the reasons why I've so leaned way more into that as kind of like a career path, if you want to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'll say this out before we wrap. That's what comes through to me in this conversation. I mean, the blending of it's a blending, it's a balancing with you, right? That's what you see. You talked about the garden and the house and the foundation. It's a theme throughout this. And to me, the highest level of that blending is like the thoughtfulness, the self-awareness and reflectiveness to be open, to question, to be aware of what you don't know, but pairing that with just more like the technology side with like a deep like pragmatism and practicalism and of like, well, we're here and I want to figure it out and I want to be analytical about it. When you put those two things together, I go back to the phrase I used before, like that's kind of how you hack life. That's kind of how you figure this thing
Yeah.
out. If there is a recipe, none of us are perfect, right? You still mess up. Obviously, we're all going to mess up, but like that seems like a pretty good recipe.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
never thought about me as a life hacker, but I'll
Really?
ponder on that in a bit.
That's to me, it's like,
Yeah.
no, that comes out because the technology piece, like that's you're always looking for the most efficient, there's like an elegance to it, right?
For
With the
sure.
technological sense. So
I'll tell you one funny thing. Like I've like instead of like typing things out, I've like saved keyboard shortcuts for like 100 things. So I never type it. I type in like 3 letters and
yeah,
it sends like a response. It's just people and like things like
yeah.
that.
If you pair that with somebody who wants to be kind, wants to develop good relationships, like you're gonna figure out how to optimize for that. And that's
Yeah.
cool, man. I think that's why you're doing what you're doing.